Welcome to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartline. I'm your host, Dr. Andrea Austin. I'm an emergency medicine physician, coach, and educator. I believe that healthcare needs to improve the quality care that patients receive, and that supporting the workers is at the heart of this transformation. Today, we're doing things a little bit different on the podcast. I will not be the host. I will be the guest today. And our host today is Dr. Resa E. Lewis. She is a great friend of mine, a wonderful colleague. She's a true friend-tour and host of the Visible Voices podcast and a fellow author. She's written extensively, including her own book with Dr. Adaira Landry called Micro Skills. And Resa, thank you so much for taking the reins of the podcast today.
It's wonderful to be here with you and on such a celebratory, auspicious day, which is your launch day.
Wow, it's here.
So audience, we are going to be discussing Andrea's book, and the title is Revitalized, a guidebook to following your healing heartline. And it is a huge honor to have been asked to host this episode and to really highlight the importance and the deliciousness, yes, I did say the word deliciousness, of this book. Andrea, I'm going to jump right in. How are you different having written this book?
I've said many times to my husband that this book was the biggest gift to myself. And what I mean by that is through the writing process, the opportunity to reflect, to process different parts of your life and connect how things from the past relate to the present and to learn. I mean, I'd be writing something and be like, is that right? What's the reference on that? Or let me call my friend that's a therapist and make sure I'm getting this right. So just so much self-discovery and forgiveness of mistakes that I've made in my own life. That's how the book has changed me.
Now, for audience members that have not yet read the book, I'm going to say that this is a self-help book. This is a memoir. This is a gift, sure, to yourself, but it's certainly a gift to the reader. And I certainly enjoyed the read and learned a lot about you, but also was able to fill in some of my own gaps regarding my professional journey, healthcare, and exactly where we are in 2024 in emergency medicine, in medicine, and in the United States healthcare system. So to that end, there are plenty of books out there on self-care, self-help, moral injury, ethical injury, and we'll get into exactly where you want to call this in terms of the moral versus ethical injury versus burnout type of book. How is this book different? Like, why should the reader pick this up, listen to it, or, crack this one open versus the 20,000 others that are out there?
Yeah. Well, I've read a lot of the books on burnout. And when I went through my most severe episode in 2021 that led to taking a sabbatical, I read a lot of them. They were great. There were some really super helpful books that I've, weaved into the book, but it didn't really encapsulate what was going on with me. I didn't feel there was a book out there that really spoke to, if you're an empathetic person, if you identify as an empath, if the caring side of healthcare in its current state, all the compromises that we have to make as healthcare professionals right now, due to how dysfunctional the system is weighing on you. How do you continue to do the work? And I didn't have a book out there that could lay out the path about how, in chapter 26, putting it all together, how could I be a revitalized healer? How could I walk with integrity, have empathy and compassion for my patients, but not feel drained? And then also harness my agency. And there just wasn't a book out there. So that's when I knew I needed to write it.
You wrote it. And to be clear, one aspect of the design of the book that sticks out is at the end of each chapter, there are questions that you ask the reader. I'll call them self-reflection questions. And to that end, this is why it's a guidebook. How has that resonated with people who have been your beta readers or even your editor?
They really appreciated that because I think a lot of times you can read a chapter or listen to it and be like, oh, I got this. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to do that. But those reflection questions are really a form of self-coaching. And certainly I'm a coach, I've been coached, and I encourage people to get coached in this book. And if you're wondering, like, what happens in coaching? A lot of it is questions that I have at the end of each chapter for you to be able to reflect and coach yourself.
I like that a lot. And to that end, it's actually very empowering. And you really focus on this element of agency, that we all as individuals have agency amidst a system that can be very, very trying. So I'd like us, for the listeners, for the readers, to dive a little into burnout, ethical injury, moral injury. I've already mentioned that we're going to talk about these terms. And for the reader, for the listener, for the audience in this podcast episode, what would you like us to use as a frame? What phrase would you like us to use?
I think burnout is still a helpful term. I know we're going through a phase where sometimes people are like, oh, burnout's overused. Burnout, I think, is a condition that can have many different root causes. But the way burnout feels is it's exhaustion. It's this feeling of reduced efficacy and also this feeling of depersonalization. Those are the three quintessential symptoms of burnout. But like many different syndromes in medicine, that describes a constellation of symptoms, but it doesn't describe the cause. I think a really important cause or root of burnout for many people right now is moral injury, or maybe rebranded ethical injury. But I want to stick with that framework for just a minute, because when we think about burnout and why sometimes it keeps happening if you don't go underneath and find out what it is for you, what's making your soul hurt in this situation. And I use the metaphor, I'm actually giving a talk later this fall, and I'm using the metaphor of a tree, that burnout is the leaves, and the root in one of the talks that I'm giving is moral injury. Another talk that I'm giving is gender bias. So it's a complicated root system under there.
I really love that imagery, and I'm glad that you shared that, and also how you use this frame in many applications. The book, for people that may think, oh, well, I don't know Dr. Andrea Austin, and, I'm not sure this is going to speak to me. I would say this book speaks to everybody because you actually describe trauma as a universal experience. And sure, we are emergency physicians, and yes, you are military, and there are many exposures that you have had, but everybody has had: childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, mid-adulthood. And you walk the reader through those experiences. And certainly some really touched me. And what touches me is going to not touch someone else, but something else will touch that someone else. I'm going to bring up some phrases that I took from the book. And I'd love if you can go deeper and share with the audience the context and why it's important generally, and why it's important that you put that into this book.
Great.
You talk about living apart together and the importance of that.
Yes. So that describes when I got military orders to move to Los Angeles, and my husband and I talked about it a lot. And it didn't really make sense for him to leave his job here in San Diego for us to sell our house. So we made a decision that I would have an apartment in downtown LA, and we would see each other about once a week. And it really felt countercultural to do that. And I had many people question if our marriage was okay, that we weren't really doing things the way other people did this. And it took a lot of strength and really looking inward to be like, we know each other and we know our lives. And this is actually the best thing for us right now.
I thought it was such a beautiful share and actually illustrative. I wanted to use the word illustrative right there. I know many women in medicine that with their partner made this decision to do the living apart together. Professionally, there was a move that didn't work for both, but they were going to go somewhere else geographically. And it meant not having that daily existence together, but yet they were clearly together living. It just wasn't, to your point, a pattern or on a time period that we may think, well, this is what couples do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And has it worked?
Oh, it worked great. Those 2 years, honestly, when I look back on it, professionally, 2 of the best years of my career. I really like my career now too, but I wouldn't have what I have now without those 2 years. And our marriage did great during those 2 years. I talk about how it added almost like a level of dating because we weren't seeing each other every day. We would see each other once a week. So we had to really make those days count. And it also, we missed each other. I missed him when I was deployed, and that wasn't that, long before I moved to Los Angeles. But what I found, at least for us, having our own lives, having hobbies, we do take trips separately. He goes hunting, like Tim Waltz. He likes to go hunting. I don't go hunting. So we have our own interests, and we miss each other in a good way.
Yeah. You shared a story with which I very much resonated about changing institutions. And you really highlighted what that did for you and how you were treated differently. And I thought this was such an accurate depiction specifically for women in medicine. And I'm going to read. A change in the city resulted in letting go of more emotional baggage. Staying at the same program where I had been a resident meant I truly felt like a respected peer among the faculty. A few less supportive and evolved faculty members took pleasure in reminding me of past mistakes and inadequacies that dated back to residency and refused to acknowledge my growth and transition from resident to peer.
Yeah, those words still land very heavy for me and take me back to that feeling. I've watched at this point many residents, leave the program they trained at, stay at the program they trained at. I've had both experiences personally, like hearkening back to the book, you are in charge of your own life. And there's certainly a way to succeed staying where you trained. And there's reasons people do that. In my case, and maybe it was the overlay of the military, I think there's just a lot of different factors. It was really good to leave. And to this day, I still really encourage residents to think about that. Is there a way you could leave and come back? Could you do a fellowship? Just even understanding the way a different healthcare system works adds to the breadth of your clinical acumen. You're more flexible and adaptable once you see, like, is this really the only way to handle the situation? A lot of times it's not. And you add diversity of thought. And then, to this day, my network is wider because I have where I trained in residency, those years in Los Angeles, my, years at San Diego, now in Temecula. It just keeps adding that diversity of thought.
Yeah. I think for listeners that may not understand the nuance we are highlighting, when you train a certain place, they know you at that level of training. And when you stay there, you don't often, it's like staying at home with your family. They don't see you as an adult. And the same thing happens in medical training. If you stay for every stage of your training, residency to fellowship to being a faculty member, you don't often get seen as fully matured or delineated as now a faculty member. People that have muscle memory and knew you when you were younger and in training keep you in that frame for themselves. And so you don't always get the same treatment, the same respect. And, what really was a bit painful to read was that, they would remind you of those errors and those mistakes from when you were younger and less experienced. So it was this constant, it was a bit of a power dynamic and a control factor that just really wasn't fair in allowing you to become as a fully fledged faculty and adult.
Yeah. And to be clear, there were some amazing people. There's somebody, and I'll shout him out right now. So Dr. Will Goldenberg was one of my attendings during residency, and he had the overnight shift with me coming on to a day shift the first day of being an attending. And we did a huddle, and he said in front of all the nurses, "This is Dr. Austin's first day as an attending." And I think he said something like she's earned this. She has all the, rights and privileges of an attending physician, and we're so glad to have her. So that was, really great allyship. So shout out to Will.
I will. As we're speaking and having this conversation, which again is such a delight, you're smiling a lot. And I bring that up because I can't not notice your teeth. I'm curious if you can share with the audience a little bit more about why your teeth and your smile is actually an important thing to bring up here.
Yeah. So I grew up in a lower middle class family, and I really needed braces. My teeth were very, very crooked. And the local dentist offered my mom a kind of solution of pulling some teeth to make more room. So they pulled some of my permanent teeth, in fact, which was a very traumatic experience that's in the book. And I ultimately didn't get braces, even though that was the plan. My mom was like, "Your teeth they're good enough." And it always bothered me. And I think I actually took it out of the book. So if you're listening right now, I'm giving a little more backstory. I felt, and once you go to medical school, you are surrounded by sometimes people of very higher class than you that had more money. And I felt that my crooked teeth were a tell. Like, maybe I don't really belong here. I didn't have the, financial backing when I was younger. And so I did find myself kind of trying to cover up my teeth or do things that I couldn't smile the way I really wanted to. And I held on to that story. And one tip I would give the listeners, if there's a story that you keep going back to and it's so well worn, you can go through it in your head. Maybe you've said it to other people. You've got it down chapter and verse. There's probably trauma there. And so the teeth were really about needing to heal this wound that, yeah, we didn't have a lot of money growing up and I didn't get braces. I'm an adult. Tell the dentist I want my teeth straighter. You get the, plastic liners and move on.
So beautiful. And circling back to how we started today's conversation about this being a gift to yourself, and you really give this very positive message of optimism and joy and of healing throughout the book. And some of those ways are to take care of yourself, do the things, fix the things, break the cycle of the storytelling that you're telling yourself. And I think it's such a great message that you share in many ways throughout the book.
Yeah. I mean, that's doing the work. If people aren't really in the therapy world, you may not know when people say I'm doing the work. What is that? I mean, it's self-improvement. It's growth. And this quote that I love in the book is doing the work helps you do the work, which is from, I believe, Prentice Hall that was on We Can Do Hard Things. And that's what really clicked is I have to keep doing the work, whatever that is, whatever self-improvement, growth, therapy, self-reflection. That's how I keep being a doctor in this very challenging system.
Yeah. I bring up teeth and dental care because I do believe it's very easy for those that have had privilege, who've always had dental insurance, whose parents were able to bring them to the orthodontist. We take these things for granted. As emergency physicians, we have patients come to the emergency department a lot with dental pain, dental caries, dental infection. And many of us know it's actually really, really difficult to access care if you don't have insurance and if you don't have the means. And it is something that plays into social determinants of health. And, you highlighted in your case, it wasn't necessarily about health. It was a story related to socioeconomics, to status, but also to self-esteem.
Self-esteem. And, honestly, there was a health component to some degree. It was about my bite and, to be a little graphic with the audience, about flossing. And so these are like practical things that, my dentist was like, this is actually very reasonable and this will keep your teeth healthier over time. So we spent a lot of time on teeth, but what is that for you as, the person listening? What is something that you didn't get to take care of or maybe wasn't valued by your family, but it's important to you now to get that taken care of?
Yeah, it's such a great share. And thank you for that. I'm going to continue on one more aspect of the video part of our conversation, and that's your hair. Who is Carmel Moreno? What is your relationship? And why was it important to include that in your book?
Yeah, so Carmel is my hairstylist here in San Diego. She's been doing my hair probably for about a decade at this point. And, the book talks about boundaries. And certainly, with somebody you pay money to, there's a boundary, right? So I make an appointment and I pay Carmel to do my hair. But what I also highlight in the book is people that you pay money to, it doesn't always have to end in this transactional interaction. And I'm fortunate that when I get my hair done by Carmel, it's more than just getting my hair cut and colored. We have a soul connection. She has seen me at my darkest moments and at some really joyful moments. And, I tell this really touching story, and this was what really, I think, solidified our bond, is before I deployed, or the first kind of warning that I was deploying, I called up Carmel's salon and it went straight to voicemail. And I left this message saying, I think I'm leaving in 2 weeks and I just want to get my hair done before I go. And I started crying as I left the voicemail, and they got me right in, and her assistant had food for me. They had flowers, and I sat and I cried in that chair. I'm going to cry right now. It was such a touching moment. And we've had that over and over again. Parents aging, sharing those stories. We talked about therapy. She was the first person that mentioned EMDR to me. So it is very much, she has a little plaque on her salon table that says hair therapy or chair therapy. Totally.
Yeah. I bring this up because I actually think many people have a intimate relationship with whoever cuts their hair, styles their hair, colors their hair. And this is no matter your gender identification. And that intimacy, part of it is someone is touching you. Someone is physically touching you. And I will share, the person that cuts my hair is the same person that's been cutting my hair for, I truly think, about 20 years now. And when I sit in the chair, he loves sharing his stories of what clients tell him and, how much they trust him because of this exchange that happens in the chair, the talking, as well as sort of that physical trust that occurs. Plus, it's quiet and it's just the two of you often in the space while the hair process is happening. And it's remarkable. And your description and bringing that in, I think, is really important. And most readers and listeners are going to identify with that relationship with whoever does their hair.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly spend a fair amount of money on my hair. And the way I justify that is it's not just about getting my hair done. It is time for me. It's time to connect with my friend. I mean, when I came back from deployment, we ran a half marathon relay together. And that was really special for me. And it, was the essentially the bookend to that deployment, running in the streets of San Diego with flags on either end was very therapeutic for me. And Carmel was there to understand that I needed that run.
The book is chock full of your stories, your personal stories. And there's a vulnerability. I think the listeners have now come to appreciate what they're going to find when they read. And there's a lot of positivity, a topic that can be actually seemingly dark and seemingly negative. I want to, really put forth the message that there's so much positivity that you share because of your commitment to your own healing and also an attempt to help other people with the healing. And to that end, you actually offer, and you said this already, I'm going to emphasize it, a lot of resources. And it can be overwhelming, the books, all the podcasts, all the people. So for people that are starting in their own healing journey, are starting to sort of dig themselves out of a feeling of burnout and moral injury, I'm wondering what your advice is on where to start. What is one book or one podcast or one technique, knowing full well there are a bajillion, but how would you counsel someone who's at their start line?
Well, I do think that trauma underlays a lot of getting stuck, this feeling, especially if this isn't your first round of burnout. A lot of times there may be trauma that's underlaying that. So I do think starting with What Happened to You by Oprah and Bruce Perry is a fundamental book. And it's also a very fast read. And whether you feel that you have a lot of personal trauma, at the very minimum, you're going to be more sensitive to other people. And I also think, just from a medicine standpoint, as a doctor, understanding trauma made me a better doctor. And the type of patients that I found most vexing, honestly, now those patients almost uniformly, the way they are acting is rooted in trauma. And so now that I've read that book, those interactions, the ones that used to drive me up a wall, really don't anymore, because I actually know it's not about me. And I know the different tools to diffuse those situations. So whether it's for your own recovery or being able to have better shifts or clinical experiences, I think that's a fundamental book.
I love that share. I love your highlighting of that book. And I love that you just used the word vexing. I'm wondering if you can go a little bit more granular, because you said those patients. Can you describe for the listeners the patients about whom you're speaking?
Yeah. So I think I have the example at the end of the book. So there was a patient about a month ago that he was in his 30s and he had had a really significant health setback that required a major operation, very unexpected. It was on his aorta for somebody that age. And he came in with a complaint about some leg pain or swelling, and he was concerned he had a DVT, a blood clot in his leg. And I examined him. I didn't think he had that. And just listening he started to go into very extreme details about his aorta surgery, which at this point was 5 or 7 years previously. It wasn't like it had just happened. So much detail, the type of detail as an emergency doctor that you're like, oh my gosh, you've got to stop. Like, I can't be in here this long. You're still going. And that used to irritate me to no end. Like, why can't this person kind of button it up? Like, I can't be here all day hearing this. These are extraneous details that do not matter. I'm going to order the ultrasound anyway. And I was able to listen. I probably did interrupt him at some point and said, we're going to get the ultrasound. And then when I came back to share the normal results that I knew were going to be normal, I then was able to open the door and say, I've thought about what you shared about your surgery and, some of the other symptoms you described today. And I'm wondering if you've ever talked to anybody about this in more detail. And he's like, are you talking about like therapy? And I'm like, maybe. And he's like, oh, well, everyone else in my family goes, but that's not for me. And I was like, tell me more about that. And then we got to this really healing place where he was like, I actually think I need to go to therapy. So that's the power of starting to do your own work and being able to recognize. I mean, it's essentially like I have another diagnosis, like, oh, this is trauma. Oh, we have treatments for that now.
You mentioned EMDR, and listeners may not be familiar with that. And so, can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So EMDR sounds crazy when you first hear it. So it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. And essentially, you meet with a therapist, and there's a few different ways they can do it. But one way is that they use a light bar, and the light goes back and forth, and you track that with your eyes. And you filled out a worksheet ahead of time, and you go through some of your past traumas, but you're not really describing them in detail. It's more like this happened and this is my thought associated with it. And then they walk you through putting in new thoughts. So for instance, I talk about early in the book that my mom dropped me off at church for Girl Scouts one night, and I entered a dark church basement and I was all alone. I was only like 5 or 6 years old. It was very scary. So the thought associated with that is I can't trust people. People will let me down. If I don't hyperfunction and do everything in my power to know exactly what's happening, then I could get hurt. So that was something that was processed, and we laid down like a new thought associated with that. But the point I really want the listeners to take from this is talk therapy alone is not that effective for trauma. So the Veterans Administration has tons of research about PTSD, depression, anxiety. So veterans, are a good population for looking at traumatic experiences. And what is emerging is that top-down therapy, talk therapy, doesn't help trauma that much and sometimes makes it worse. And bottom-up therapy like EMDR that involves a somatic element, something with your body, whether it's this eye movement, whether it's yoga, dance, whatever it is, trauma has to leave your body. And it sounds crazy, but this is what the overwhelming evidence is showing at this point, is that these bottom-up approaches, whether it's EMDR, some other type of somatic therapy, is what gets the trauma processed.
Yeah. So you've shared when someone is trying to figure out where to start, an example of a book, example of a technique, any podcast you would send someone to?
We Can Do Hard Things by Glennon Doyle. You can see that podcast is weaved throughout the book. The episodes they have are definitely the fundamental ones to start with.
Great. You speak about this addiction to productivity, and many listeners, I suspect, are going to understand what that means and have an affinity towards that. What would you say about people that have an addiction to productivity?
Well, what's underneath of it? And I think for most of the physicians that I've talked with, what's underneath of it is this fundamental belief that their worth is tied to their productivity. And the power of doing this work is starting to understand that your worth is not tied to your productivity. You are worthy as a human being living on this planet. And so usually there's some trauma associated with that why has this productivity become the way that you have value and matter in this world? And what is it keeping you from?
So I'll ask you, what did your addiction to productivity keep you from?
It's kept me from a lot of things. So many things. I think my health has suffered in some ways. I'm still a pretty healthy person, but certainly in the last year, I've like let go of some of my exercise routines. I would also say, and I talk about it in the book, and I'll get probably a little emotional talking about it, but probably not having children was in part tied to productivity. There's a lot more to that I unpack in the book, but there was a real concern and certainly overt messaging that we've received that having a child would slow me down and stymie my career. And that probably will be one of my regrets or considerations of my life, that I let that narrative take up too much space.
Thank you for sharing that and, verbalizing aloud that I don't think you're alone in this world, having received and actually integrated that messaging and let it get under the skin and help determine how someone lives professionally. Listeners may know you were generous in sharing that I host a podcast called The Visible Voices. And I ask my guests, when did you realize you had a voice? And when did you start using your voice? And so now I ask you those questions.
Such a good question. I think the first time I realized I had a voice was when my program director asked me to be a chief resident. That was a big signal. I didn't really think people cared about my contributions or thought I was, had value. And that was the first time that I was like, oh, maybe I do have something I want to share with people.
Yeah. What's keeping you up at night?
Gosh, well, when this podcast comes out, it will be very close to the election. So honestly, what's keeping me up right now is our country and the divisiveness. And I honestly wish more people were doing the work, because I think if people were thinking about how to actively listen, how to connect, how to heal trauma, I think our country would be in a lot better place. So I'm thinking about, I want people to use their agency to vote. And I honestly don't care who you're voting for. I think people that listen to my podcast and probably your podcast knows who we're voting for. But I want people to use their agency. And I want people to have good dialogues, listen to people. And even if you don't agree with them, the message, this is the day after Tim Walz's speech at the DNC about, we take care of our neighbors. Let's do more of that. Let's take care of our neighbors. Let's take care of our colleagues. The next time you're on the phone with a consultant, let's take care of each other.
You share a very fantastic story about a snow globe.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like you to share that story and with the audience why they too need the equivalent of a snow globe.
Somewhere along the way, somebody gave me this idea when I was pretty young that you can have a totem, something in your life that reminds you about what's important and what you're working towards. So I'm from a very small town in Iowa, and at the drugstore, they would have like little knickknacks. And so this was a snow globe that they had there. If you wind it up, it plays a song. You shake it. There's nice glitter. And I love it because it said anatomy, biology, and chemistry. So, the books that you need as a pre-med or probably pre-med. And so I had that probably middle school or high school is when I bought it. And it had been with me through all these different moves. And it got lost, shall we say, when I moved to San Diego. And I missed it. I was like, I really missed that snow globe, as silly as that sounds. And so I thought it was just like lost. And then one day, and it was through this reparenting process, I was like, I'm just going to search the internet and see if I can find this snow globe. And sure enough, it was on eBay, and it wasn't like a crazy amount of money. So I was like, I'm going to buy it. And so there I have it. I have to me, it looks exactly the same as the one that I had in high school. And emotionally, spiritually, it's the same.
Yeah. Dr. Austin, it's been amazing speaking with you on this celebratory day and also about your book and what you've put out in the world. If listeners are wondering where they can get a copy and how they can be in touch with you, please offer
Yes.
that information.
Yes. So I would encourage listeners to go to my website, AndreaAustinMD.com, and there's a page set up for the book. As of this recording, it will be on Amazon. My hope is that it's on other platforms, as I know people like to get their books in lots of different ways, which I completely support. So starting off at my website will be the best place to see where it's available and to find the link. And then I also encourage you to go to my website because people that order the book can get a copy of a free ebook. So if you don't want to write in your book, you can print off the ebook and have a separate journal to write in as well. But I wrote the book encouraging people to write in the book. But I have an option, a freebie for people that feel that books are sacred and can't write in it, then print off the ebook. And then I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn are the two platforms I'm using the most. And my handle on Instagram is Andrea Austin, MD.
And listeners, if you're wondering how to really support to the next level Dr. Andrea Austin, when you read the book, when you buy the book on Amazon, please give her 5-star reviews. The more 5-star reviews, the more reviews there are, the more the book will be put on everybody's radar. Dr. Andrea Austin, congratulations on your publication of your book, and it's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you.
And it's been such a treat to have you take over hosting this week. Thank you so much, Dr. Resa E. Lewis.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Heartline, conversations with healthcare changemakers following their heartlines. I'd so appreciate it if you could take a quick moment and hit the like button and also the subscribe button that you'll find within your podcast app or platform that you're listening on. It also really helps if you can leave a review. I would certainly appreciate a 5-star review and a few comments about what you liked about this podcast. Don't forget, you can also forward this to people in your network. People love getting new podcasts and changing up what they're listening to. So sending a podcast to a friend or colleague, or even to start a conversation about a change that needs to happen in your organization is a great way to be a change maker. This podcast represents the views of the host and guests. It does not represent the views of any entity we work for or with. It is also for informational use only and does not replace any professional advice, including medical or psychological. If you are interested in unlocking your true potential, reach out to me. If you're an organization interested in supporting the well-being of your people, I'd love to connect on innovative solutions. Schedule a strategy session at AndreaAustinMD.com. Sound editing services are provided by Better Podcasting Services, and you can find their website at betterpodcastingservices.com. And I'd also like to thank our future Dr. Caitlin Din, who is the production assistant for this podcast.